A quiet town is terrorized when a beloved grandmother falls victim to a horrific crime.
We discovered her body in the trunk of the car.
There was so much evidence of suffering. There was so much evidence of fear. The most horrific thing that most people could ever imagine.
With no clear leads, police must face disturbing questions. Was this a random attack?
Just at a total loss of why and how somebody would do this.
Or had the victim fallen prey to a monster lurking in the shadows?
The video surveillance showed this young lady pacing back and forth.
He was searching for a dead lady in the trunk of a car as we were investigating the case.
As investigators scramble for answers, a torrid and desperate romance comes into focus.
She just wanted his affection and his love so bad, she was willing to do anything.
He was denying their relationship, and she got angry.
They pick her up like an object and toss her into the trunk.
Sometimes we make the worst decisions when it comes to being in love with someone.
In the Atlanta suburb of Fairburn, in Fulton County, Georgia, life slows down for its nearly 16,000 residents.
It's an area where you have nice homes, nice schools, just a nice area altogether. Very small, very quiet.
But the town's veneer of peace and safety is shattered on the morning of December 22, 2017, when local police receive a call about a suspicious vehicle parked behind a popular restaurant.
A citizen called about a car that looked kind of unusual. Basically, a car sitting out there, shattered glass on the driver's side, and it's really sitting out in the middle of the road.
Once the officers arrived at the location, they observed the driver's side window busted out and the keys to the vehicle was laying on the car seat. The officer then contacted 911 communications to run the tags through GCIC because he felt like the car was stolen.
Officers learned the vehicle is registered to a local 58-year-old resident named Tony Abad.
He asked his dispatcher to try to contact the owner of the vehicle to see if perhaps the vehicle was stolen overnight and she just hadn't woken up to discover it yet.
The dispatcher's calls to Tony's residence go unanswered. Meanwhile, the officer continues his search of the vehicle.
The car's kind of strewn about. Looks like maybe somebody's been through the contents of the center console. There's shards of glass everywhere inside that vehicle. And there's a couple little smears of blood right there on the edge of the seat near the driver's side door.
The officer then went to the back of the vehicle and opened up the trunk.
There is a woman's body in the trunk of the car.
A crime scene investigation unit arrives moments later.
She had significant injuries to her head and her face, so she was severely beaten to death.
While authorities are unable to visually identify the victim, they do notice a name tag on the front of her clothing.
That person in the trunk was still wearing a grocery store uniform. At that moment, they knew it was Tony Abad.
To definitively say that the person in the trunk was Tony Abad, we used a rapid fingerprint scanner, and her fingerprints did come back as Tony Abad.
As detectives continue surveying the crime scene, it becomes clear that Tony had endured an excruciating death.
There was a significant amount of blood inside the trunk of the car to possibly suggest that she still could have been alive inside the trunk of that car before she was discovered.
There was so much evidence of suffering. There was so much evidence of fear.
They wanted to know who would do something like this. Who would want to hurt Tony?
Georgia native Tony Abad was known for her Southern charm.
People were just drawn to her personality. You could just tell that they all really cared a lot about her. and the feeling was mutual.
She had a great smile and bright eyes that kind of drew people in and made them feel comfortable.
She has a laugh that once you hear it, you'll never forget it.
A divorced mother to 4 boys and 5 grandchildren, Toni had always valued her family above everything else.
She gave birth to me when she was 15. She was just an amazing mother, even as a young teenage girl to me. And we became, like best friends, basically almost like we grew up together.
She met my dad years later and had 3 other kids, me included, with my father.
While her marriage didn't last, Toni's family always remained her top priority.
Perfect grandmother, just amazing.
When she would talk about her grandkids, her eyes would just sparkle, and they could do no wrong.
When she wasn't helping care for her 5 grandchildren, Toni worked as the deli manager at one of Fairburn's most popular grocery stores.
Toni just really enjoyed the people she worked with, and they enjoyed her. I think one said that she was the mom of the store, and the customers, they enjoyed seeing her when they would come into the store. She enjoyed seeing them.
In December of 2017, Toni was looking forward to taking some time off work and spending the upcoming Christmas holiday with her loved ones.
We would always get together on Christmas Eve, have a huge dinner, and Mom just looked forward to that so much.
But Toni's plans for a happy holiday come to a bleak end on December 22nd, when authorities find her dead body stuffed in the trunk of her car. The fact that the majority of the broken glass is found inside Toni's car suggests that the attack might have occurred somewhere else.
There was nothing on the actual roadway itself that would have indicated that someone came up and struck that window where the car was parked. So we've got all this glass on the inside, nothing at all on the outside. So they know probably our original scene is going to have some glass and possibly signs of a violent struggle.
But detectives are having a hard time discerning a motive.
Police were unable to find her cell phone, but Toni's keys and her wallet were still in the car. Her credit cards and her ID were still in her wallet. There was something going on here other than a robbery.
With no evidence pointing to who killed Toni or why, detectives contact her family and break the devastating news.
I was in denial, thinking, no, it can't be my mother. I said, do I need to come down there and identify to see if this is indeed my mom? And he said, no, Mr. Chambly, we did a rapid fingerprint thing that they can do, and that was definitely her.
It was unbelievable. I mean, never in my wildest dreams or thoughts did I think anything like this could happen in my family, especially Toni. I was just devastated.
Coming up, police dig deeper into Toni's life and discover an ominous clue about her final moments.
This female approached them wearing a black jacket that had a fur hood on it.
And as detectives race to track down a killer, new evidence points to a disturbing romance.
She just wanted his affection and his love so bad, she was willing to do anything.
On December 22nd, 2017, police in Fairburn, Georgia, have discovered the badly beaten body of 58-year-old grandmother Toni Abad inside the trunk of her car.
The medical examiner was able to determine that she was killed by blunt force trauma to the head.
Given the severity of Toni's injuries, detectives suspect her killer was driven by a personal motive. But that theory doesn't seem to hold water with her family.
She had no boyfriend, so I didn't, there was nothing there. I was just at a total loss of why and how somebody would do this to my mom.
Tony didn't have an enemy in the world.
The last thing on my mind was that this was some kind of personal confrontation type deal. You know, she tried to treat everybody with respect, whether or not she liked them.
Had Tony been the target of a random crime? Detectives believe that if they can track down Tony's missing cell phone, it might lead them to the killer.
Since there was not a phone in the car that belonged to Tony Abad, we pinged the phone through the cell phone company. We were able to get a location on the phone, which was located on Church Street off of Highway 92. From where we found Tony Abad's car to the actual crime scene was about 5 miles apart.
It's just kind of a off the beaten path type of roadway. And as you drive down that road, you kind of feel like you're driving towards a dead end or the middle of nowhere.
Within moments of their arrival, detectives locate Tony's phone by the side of the road. Just a few yards away, they find signs that a struggle had occurred.
They found blood spatter. They also found broken pieces of auto glass.
We were about 100% sure that once our crime scene techs did the blood analysis on the blood that was found on scene, that it was going to belong to Tony Abad.
Detectives send the phone off for forensic analysis. While they wait on the results, they next head to the grocery store where Tony worked, and the last known place she was seen alive.
Police went to that grocery store, interviewed the manager, and asked, who was this person? Can you tell us about Tony?
Tony's co-workers reiterate what her family told detectives.
She was loved by her co-workers, loved working there.
This is a person who will always help everyone. She was a grandmother. She would never want to hurt anyone, so they really had no idea who would want to hurt Tony.
But one of Tony's co-workers offers detectives a new lead. When she tells them that she and Tony had been approached by a stranger after they had closed the store the night before.
This female approached them wearing the black jacket that had a fur hood on it. She asked Miss Abad to give her a ride home.
The co-worker says after a brief pause, she saw Tony agree to give the young woman a ride.
She remembers being concerned, distinctly concerned, that Miss Abad would say yes because of the kind of person that she was.
This is 4 days before Christmas. It's cold outside. This is the South Atlanta winter. And you have a young lady asking for help, getting a ride. I'm sure when Tony walked out of her job that night, she really just saw the face of one of her children when they were 18 and they needed help.
Looking at this young woman who was very thin, you know, really small build, she wasn't willing to leave her there alone.
But who was this woman? Detectives review the store's surveillance tapes from the night of Tony's shift and confirm her co-worker's story.
The video surveillance showed this young lady pacing back and forth in front of the two entrances and exits to the supermarket.
You can tell she's on her phone. She's got her headphones in.
The video then shows Tony and her co-worker exiting the store at 11:30 p.m.
They walked out into the parking lot that night.
The kind of eerie thing is, you see Tony and her co-workers walk right past that unknown woman.
Though the surveillance video captured the young woman's physical build, it's impossible to identify her from the video alone. Using a still frame from the video, police canvassed the shopping center, hoping someone in the area might recognize the young woman. They catch a break when they speak to the employees of a nearby restaurant.
One of the detectives just sort of casually asked, hey, like, have you seen anybody meeting this description? Did you see anything last night? Sort of young girl, puffy jacket. They're like, oh yeah, she's here all the time.
The manager there stated that they have tried to call the police because she's been up there for several days, just sitting, loitering in the location. And that on the final day, she left all of her belongings in the location.
She left a big bag of clothes and, her makeup and stuff and toiletries.
When detectives search the bag's belongings, they catch a major break.
We were able to find an ID that identified DeAsia Page.
At this point, we're kind of in the market for everything we can get on this individual. We're trying to find out who she is.
Detectives search official records for DeAsia Page. They learn she's a recent high school dropout. They also find a local address for the 18-year-old.
Police were unable to find her at the listed address. Her mother said her and DeAsia had gotten into a fight weeks ago, and DeAsia no longer lived there.
DeAsia, like a lot of 18-year-old girls, she wanted to be independent. And that led to a lot of altercations at home as her home life was trying to balance her independence with her being a responsible young adult. And things got a little bit tumultuous with her mother, and eventually she left the house.
According to DeAsia's mom, teenage rebellion hadn't always been a problem. Until recently, DeAsia was a shy and sweet teenager who didn't rock the boat at home or school.
She was the type of person, she wouldn't speak unless you speak first to her. But as you get to know her, you would see her fun, bubbly side.
We used to call ourselves the Three Musketeers. I don't know why, but we did. Especially when we came close, that used to all be our nickname. We were just in our own circle, doing our own thing. We really didn't too much care about other people.
She always came over my house, and we would just talk and watch TV, teenage stuff.
She was very nice, and she was a very giving person. When I first met her, I didn't have a job, and she used to buy me and Erica's lunch or buy us stuff like that, just to show us that she appreciated us.
According to her mom, the problems had started several months earlier when DeAsia had grown close to an 18-year-old named Jared Kemp.
Jared grew up in this rural community of Fairburn, and he knew a lot of people in the area.
Jared came from a good family. He was charming, he was handsome, popular by all accounts.
At some point, he entered military school, and he intended to go into the Coast Guard.
It wasn't long before DeAsia had fallen head over heels for the high school senior.
Probably 2 weeks after, she was like, yeah, I love him and all of that. And we was like, whoa. We was like, I think it's a little too soon to say, love, but she was in love. You could not change her mind.
But DeAsia's mom tells police that she had quickly learned Jared was a bad influence on her daughter.
At some point in high school, Jared began hanging out with a rougher crew, getting into a lot of trouble. And he didn't mind showing that tougher side to DeAsia.
He'll call her the H word or the B word. And she'd be like, oh, he was just mad. And we would be like, it doesn't matter. That's not your name.
Them are red flags, and I used to tell her that all the time.
As a teenager, when you're in love, you want to do anything to make that person happy, to be with them. And anybody that infringes on that relationship or doesn't agree become the enemy.
The more deep in love she got with him, the more she started to withdraw from everybody, and the more she was on, oh, I'm grown, I can do whatever I want to do.
I felt like I was losing a close friend, wow, we were so close, and you're letting someone else kind of break up our friendship.
Detectives learned that DeAsia's mom had been so troubled by her daughter's relationship, she'd given the teenager an ultimatum earlier that month.
I think mom trying to kind of teach her a lesson, saying well, you're not going to be here and disrespect me. And DeAsia left.
She didn't want to listen to her mama. She was in too deep. She was in love too deep, and she just felt like he was the person for her.
Shortly after, DeAsia had dropped out of school.
She came up and she's like, yeah, I'm coming to withdraw. Like, I'm not coming back. Like, I'm not doing it. And it was like DeAsia wasn't there.
She wasn't in her mind. She was not in her right state of mind. She was gone somewhere else.
Had DeAsia been involved in Tony Abad's murder? To find out, police know they need to locate the 18-year-old runaway as soon as possible.
We ended up putting out a bolo for DeAsia.
Police released a picture of DeAsia Page. People really wanted to find this girl, figure out how she was involved in this murder of a grandmother.
Authorities in Fulton County, Georgia are searching for 18-year-old DeAsia Page in connection to the murder of local resident Tony Abad. With no insight into where DeAsia is now, detectives saturate the local news and social media with the teenager's photo.
The community reacted within seconds. You gotta understand, that picture started to flood social media. It was on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. People wanted to know who this girl was because they figured out that she would be the person who could lead to some answers in this case.
Within hours, a promising tip comes in from 2 security guards.
We received a phone call from a security guard that worked at the local Texaco gas station on Highway 92, stating that he needed to talk to the detectives.
Detectives meet with the security guard and one of his co-workers. They learn that both men had first met DeAsia Page about a week earlier, when she had approached them while they were on a smoke break.
They had seen her walking by before, and she had a fleece blanket over her shoulders. It was freezing cold, and he offered to her, you know, if you can hang out in my car if you want to get some free heat for a second. She agreed.
Page told the security guard that she needed a place to stay because at this point she was homeless.
According to the security guards, DeAsia had returned each night that week. But on the night of December 21st, DeAsia had been noticeably upset when she arrived at the gas station.
All of a sudden, she shows up and says she just witnessed a woman being killed down the street.
These are people that she really barely knows for all intents and purposes, so it's a super bizarre exchange. They quickly just process this as some sort of a story, maybe just her trying to get attention. It's not until the next day where they see the news that they realize she told them something real.
The timeline of their story matched the timeline of Tony's murder. And the gas station was just blocks away from the crime scene itself. So investigators believe that DeAsia probably witnessed Tony's murder as well as the person who did it.
Detectives thank the witnesses for the information. By the time they get back to the station, tips in response to the media's blitz featuring DeAsia's name and picture have begun to pour in.
People loved Tony, so there was a real urgency to find the person or persons responsible for her death.
But before police can follow up on any of the rumored sightings, DeAsia herself walks into the Fulton County Police Station and asks to speak with detectives.
She turns herself in, the black jacket with the fur hood that she is seen wearing on the surveillance the night Miss Abad is picked up.
When detectives sit down with DeAsia, she admits that she had accepted a ride from Tony Abad sometime after 11 p.m. on December 21st.
DeAsia said she had just legitimately just asked for a ride from Miss Abad, and she got a ride.
DeAsia was homeless, but she knew if she went to the Texaco gas station, she could probably sleep a few hours in the security guard's vehicle.
DeAsia says she gave Tony directions to the gas station, but as they neared their destination, she and Tony were suddenly blindsided when two men had attacked them.
She stated that while they're driving down the road, two black men jumped out and started attacking the vehicle.
DeAsia claimed that they smashed the window and Tony had fallen out of the car trying to get away.
One of the men ran away and the other began to beat Tony Abad with the bat.
DeAsia says she watched helplessly as the man beat Tony to death in front of her. Then he ordered her to help him dispose of Tony's body.
DeAsia stated that she didn't want to, but the guy then threatened her life. So she put the body in a truck and was forced to drive the car and park it on the access road.
Detectives are skeptical. If DeAsia had witnessed such a vicious crime, why not call the police?
Her story that two random guys stopped the car, killed Tony for no reason, then forced DeAsia to help them made absolutely no sense.
I think Detective Jackson pretty quickly summarily dismissed the plausibility of that version of events. He says, I'm gonna leave the room and I'm gonna come back and give you, a second bite of the apple.
That's when Fulton County detectives get a call from their counterparts in the nearby community of Chattahoochee Hills and learn they've just received a surprise visit from DeAsia's boyfriend.
He came in to talk to the police proactively, and he just says, saw her on the news, don't know anything else, I'm not involved in this.
At that time, Jared Kemp stated that DeAsia was crazy.
Jared claimed he wasn't dating DeAsia anymore. In fact, he said it was a very brief fling. He really didn't know her all that well. But he said he wanted to come forward to investigators because he didn't want his name tied to a murder.
He denies essentially any involvement or even having seen her recently.
Detectives turn their attention back to DeAsia and press her about her relationship with Jared Kemp.
She does learn that Jared Kemp has proactively gone to the police himself and essentially said he barely knows her.
DeAsia was clearly heartbroken that Jared was denying their relationship, and she got angry. She immediately changed her story to police and told them that Jared was responsible for the whole thing and that Jared was the one who killed Tony Abad.
Coming up, police must decipher who's telling the truth in a high-stakes game of he said, she said.
You see a shift in her, realizing that she's at the end of her road. He tells her, this is serious, I need the truth.
But will one of the two suspects disappear before justice can be served?
We executed a search warrant at Jared Kemp's home. While we were there, his mother told us that he wasn't at the location.
In Fulton County, Georgia, DeAsia Page has just implicated her boyfriend, Jared Kemp, in the murder of Tony Abad. According to DeAsia, it was Jared's idea to steal a car so DeAsia could have a place to sleep.
I think there was some obligation on Jared's part to take care of DeAsia. After all, she had nowhere else to go. So this is when they began to think of ways to find a place for DeAsia to stay as soon as possible.
She stated that they came up with a plan to steal someone's car for the night so that she could have somewhere to sleep for a couple of hours.
DeAsia told us she was looking for a way out of living on the street and this repeated cycle of sleeping in the night watchman's car, spending all day at the shopping center, and then doing it all over again. Jared told her, you bring the car to me and I will take care of the rest.
On December 21st, DeAsia says she was hanging out at the Fairburn Shopping Center when she spotted Tony Abad and her co-worker leaving the grocery store.
DeAsia told police this was all about getting someone to give her a ride home and then carjacking that person. According to DeAsia, there was never supposed to be a murder. but that's not how it ended up.
DeAsia tells detectives that she called Jared and told him she was on her way. 10 minutes later, she instructed Tony to turn down Church Street, where she knew Jared was waiting.
DeAsia said that she pulled out an airsoft pistol that Jared had given her for the purpose of stealing a car, or for protection.
Once they turned down the road of Church Street, the light shined into the car where Tony Abad was able to see the gun on DeAsia's lap. At that point, the fight was on.
Miss Abad makes a move for her life, essentially. Reaches out, and there is a very brief, probably just a few seconds, struggle over the gun.
Meanwhile, while this is going on, Jared has emerged from the woodline and he smashed the driver's glass window. So while he beats the glass with a baseball bat, the victim crawls over the passenger seat and ends up outside the car.
She actually sustained a lot of injuries from that glass coming through and striking her on the left side of her face.
According to DeAsia, Tony suddenly turned to Jared and began pleading for her life.
When she's out on the asphalt, DeAsia would be standing over her. Now Jared Kemp is standing over her as well, and she says, "Please don't do this. Please don't do this."
She was begging and pleading for her life. She talked about Christmas just being a few days away and the fact that she had a young granddaughter and she just wanted to make it to Christmas to see her.
But DeAsia says Jared wasn't about to take any risks.
He knew that Tony was not likely going to be okay with them stealing the car, someone that had seen DeAsia's face and that could possibly know DeAsia was on the phone with Jared Kemp.
Jared Kemp came up to the victim and started striking her in the head several times with a baseball bat until she fell to the ground.
They believe that they've killed her. Jared tells DeAsia, "You get her hands," and he grabs her feet. And they pick her up like an object, you know, like something inhuman, and toss her into the trunk.
They could have left her there. Maybe someone would have driven by and seen and been able to render aid. Instead, they put her body in the trunk of her own car.
DeAsia claims Jared instructed her to wipe the car and dump it.
So he is going to, of course, leave on foot. For whatever reason, DeAsia agrees to get in this car with a body now in the trunk.
She was so in love with him that she was willing to do anything he said, anything he wanted her to do, and that included getting rid of a body.
DeAsia drove the car and parked it on the access road, and Jared went to hide the baseball bat before walking home.
DeAsia says after she dropped off the car, she went to the gas station, dumping her bloody clothes along the way.
Immediately after this crime, she was in crisis mode, and for DeAsia Page, it meant telling the first two people she saw.
DeAsia says she continued to communicate with Jared the rest of the night.
Jared is really telling her in those few hours after she makes it back to the truck, it's us against the world. He really needs her not to say anything and to show her loyalty.
Despite her claims, detectives suspect DeAsia might be downplaying her role in the violence.
We questioned her on that pretty aggressively. DeAsia struggled with coming to terms with or being candid about her physical role in the actual beating of Miss Abad.
We do believe that DeAsia, actively participated in the violence that night and certainly helped load Tony Abad's body into the trunk of her own car. So she was more than just like a getaway driver.
Still, detectives struggle with the reasoning behind Tony's violent death.
Even if they intended to just carjack Miss Abad, the fact that they so egregiously and aggressively bludgeoned her, that speaks to a level of violence that leaves only one conclusion, that the moment that they arrived on that road, they intended to kill her.
DeAsia Page is officially charged with murder. News of her arrest stuns her friends and loved ones.
I would have never even thought of something like this. No, it was. I was very Shock isn't even the word. I was just mind blown.
While the Abad family is relieved to learn there's been an arrest in the case, they also have questions.
I was just grateful that they had her, but I also knew that she wasn't alone.
I didn't think for a second that she did this by herself. Mom was a pretty tough woman. You know, I looked at DeAsia, I looked at the photos of her, and I was like, no way. My mom would have tore that girl up.
The following day, a warrant is issued for Jared's arrest, and the police are looking for him.
But with only DeAsia's statement against her former lover, authorities fear an accused killer might just get away with murder.
We really can't go to trial solely alone on the accusation of a co-conspirator.
18-year-old DeAsia Page has just confessed to her role in the brutal murder of 58-year-old Tony Abad. DeAsia has also implicated her boyfriend, Jared Kemp, as the crime's mastermind.
I think there's some variation in what DeAsia thought was going to happen and what Jared planned to do. But I do think that DeAsia was 100% along for the ride once that decision was made.
Detectives have been unable to locate Jared since his last statement to authorities.
We executed a search warrant at Jared Kemp's home. While we were there, his mother told us that he wasn't at the location, that he was at his cousin's apartment.
This was Christmas Eve, and once they located that address, the police went there and he was taken into custody without incident.
At the station, detectives confront Jared with DeAsia's confession, but he's suddenly tight-lipped.
So it's interesting that he came in to talk to the police proactively, and then the day following, he's arrested, and now he's mum. He's got nothing to say to the police.
With Jared refusing to cooperate, detectives collect his cell phone and uncover a treasure trove of digital evidence.
What we found was a significant amount of communication with DeAsia on December 21st, which was the night of the murder. They spoke somewhere between FaceTime calls and voice calls, somewhere in the neighborhood of 6.5 hours on December 21st. So a significant amount of time. So for Jared to come in after the fact and say, you know, this is just someone that I have a casual relationship with, I don't know her well, the phone records are telling a vastly different story.
Detectives corroborate DeAsia's story that she spoke with Jared on the phone as Tony gave her a ride.
They're on a phone call up until the moment that car arrives at the murder scene. That is an open line and active phone call. So we know as they rode silently in the road that night, Jared Kemp was breathing in her ear. And the phone call only terminates because he's now ready to come out of the wood line and kill Tony Abad.
Jared's search history also presents damning evidence against the teen.
Arguably the most important evidence that we found in Jared's phone was when we looked at the web history.
We learned that on the day that we located Tony Abad's body, he was searching for a dead lady in the trunk of a car as we were investigating the case.
When I overlaid Jared's web search history with the Fulton County Police CAD record for the discovery of Miss Abad's car, what we found was in the minutes that preceded the discovery of her body, he was searching for essentially a woman found in the trunk of a car in Fairburn.
Unfortunately, authorities are unable to collect any physical evidence against Jared.
We received information that Jared buried the bat in his backyard, but we weren't able to find anything.
Even still, the digital evidence, combined with DeAsia's confession, are enough for authorities to charge Jared Kemp with Tony's murder. Prosecutors offer DeAsia a plea deal in exchange for her testimony against Jared.
She gives a full confession. She implicates herself then again to the police when she's interviewed. That was the only really route she had to go.
On October 2nd, 2019, Jared Kemp's murder trial begins in a Fulton County courtroom. Prosecutors use the digital evidence, along with DeAsia's testimony, to assert that Jared and DeAsia had committed premeditated murder.
My best analysis when it comes to motive of Jared Kemp and DeAsia Page in this murder, I believe that DeAsia was an immature, impressionable young lady that was homeless and desperate. And she was doing partly what she wanted to do and part what others had convinced her to do. I believe that when Jared was waiting in that wood line on Church Street after directing DeAsia to drive down that dirt road with a victim in a car, he was driven by a motivation to kill.
There were several really critical windows where they could have turned back and chose not to.
Ultimately, Jared Kemp is found guilty of felony murder, armed robbery, aggravated assault, and hijacking a vehicle, and is sentenced to life in prison. In exchange for her cooperation, DeAsia Page receives a 30-year sentence.
I was very happy with the sentence, and I hope he doesn't ever make it out. And I hope the same for her.
I knew where she came from. I knew her family. I knew her. I would never think that she would have been a part of something like this, but sometimes we make the worst decisions, when it comes to being in love with someone.
I don't want to put everything on him because, we all make our own decisions, but I feel like if it weren't for him, none of that would have happened.
I can promise you, if it was just because DeAsia needed a place to sleep, my granny would have given her, here's $100, here's $200, go get a motel for the night. That's just who she was. There was no need to take her away from her children, her grandchildren.
It was senseless, it was useless, and ultimately, it took away this woman who was beloved in her community. And for what? They didn't get the car. They didn't get any money. They didn't have to do what they did.
In the summer of 1946, London was trying to remember how to breathe again. The war was over. The sirens had stopped. The blackouts that once swallowed entire neighborhoods every night had finally become memories. Instead of routine, across Britain, exhausted families were attempting to rebuild ordinary lives from the wreckage left behind by 6 years of fear, rationing, separation, and death. Men returned home wearing uniforms that carried the weight of survival. Women who had spent the war years working in factories, hospitals, and offices stepped back into a society struggling to redefine itself. There was relief in the air, but it was a fragile kind of relief. The streets were crowded again. Dance halls reopened. Hotels filled with travelers, soldiers, businessmen, and strangers drifting through a country still recovering from trauma. People wanted distraction. They wanted glamour. They wanted to believe the worst period of their lives had ended. And in that atmosphere, trust became dangerously easy to manufacture. A military uniform meant something in 1946 Britain. It represented sacrifice, status, discipline, and heroism. A charming man wearing medals could walk into almost any restaurant, hotel, or nightclub and instantly command attention. Few people questioned impressive stories about wartime service. Few people asked for proof. Britain was full of men passing through cities with vague backgrounds and uncertain futures. In the confusion of the post-war years, identity itself had become fluid. That was the world Neville Heath understood perfectly. Long before his name became synonymous with one of the most disturbing murder cases in post-war British history, Heath had already mastered the art of performance. He understood how people wanted to see him. He knew how to speak with confidence, how to hold eye contact, how to create the illusion of sophistication and authority. Witnesses would later describe him as handsome, elegant, polished, and unusually calm. He dressed carefully. He spoke like an educated officer. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he belonged anywhere he entered. And for a while, that performance worked. It worked in bars. It worked in expensive hotels. It worked with strangers. Most horrifying of all, it worked with women who saw in him the image of stability and charm at a time when the world desperately craved both. But beneath the surface, there was another reality entirely. Behind the polished appearance and military persona was a man whose violence would shock even experienced investigators. A man capable of cruelty so extreme that newspapers across Britain struggled to describe it without horrifying their readers. A man who did not kill in panic or desperation, but with a chilling sense of control. And unlike many murder cases that begin with a sudden disappearance or a violent confrontation witnessed in public, the Neville Heath case began quietly, behind a hotel door, in a room surrounded by ordinary life. In June of 1946, staff at a hotel in Kensington became aware of unusual sounds coming from one of the rooms. Raised voices, disturbances during the night. At the time, it may not have seemed extraordinary. Hotels in post-war London were full of arguments, drinking, couples meeting in secret, travelers arriving late at night. People minded their own business. After years of war, there was a widespread instinct not to interfere unless absolutely necessary. But by the following day, something felt wrong. The silence inside the room had become unsettling. When the door was finally opened, the illusion surrounding Neville Heath began to collapse. Inside, 32-year-old Marjorie Gardner was found dead on the bed. The scene investigators encountered was horrifying. Gardner's body showed evidence of severe physical violence. There were signs of prolonged assault, marks suggesting she had been beaten repeatedly, injuries indicating extreme sexual violence. She had been strangled. Detectives immediately recognized that this was not a spontaneous act of rage. The injuries were too extensive. The violence had unfolded over time. What disturbed investigators almost as much as the brutality itself was the apparent calmness left behind at the scene. The room had not been destroyed in chaos. There was no evidence of panic. Certain details suggested the killer had taken time after the murder to regain composure. That realization created a different kind of fear. Crimes committed in panic often leave disorder behind them. But controlled violence suggested something colder, something deliberate, someone capable of inflicting suffering while remaining emotionally detached. And in the days that followed, police began piecing together the identity of the man last seen with Marjorie Gardner. Witnesses remembered him because he wanted to be remembered. He stood out. He dressed too well, spoke too confidently, claimed impressive military credentials. He introduced himself as a Royal Air Force officer with wealth, status, and connections. People recalled his charm almost as clearly as they recalled his arrogance. Even before his arrest, Neville Heath was becoming a figure of fascination. But at that stage, investigators still did not fully understand what they were dealing with. They did not yet know that Marjorie Gardner would not be his only known victim. They did not yet realize that another young woman would soon die after encountering the same. Carefully constructed persona. And they could not yet see how deeply Heath relied on appearance as a weapon. What makes the Neville Heath case endure decades later is not only the brutality of the murders themselves, but the disturbing contradiction at the center of the story. Society often imagines violent predators as visibly threatening figures. People expect danger to announce itself clearly. But Heath presented himself as the opposite of dangerous. He appeared refined, respectable, civilized. He used charm the way others might use force. In many ways, the murders exposed a deeper cultural vulnerability inside post-war Britain. The country had learned to trust uniforms automatically, to associate appearance with character, to believe confidence signaled competence and decency. Heath manipulated those assumptions expertly. And perhaps that is why the case produced such fear once details became public. It forced people to confront an uncomfortable possibility that evil could exist behind manners, behind elegance, behind a polished smile and careful conversation. That violence did not always look monstrous at first glance. The newspapers covering the case would later call Heath the gentleman killer, a phrase both sensational and deeply unsettling. It captured the contradiction that made him so terrifying to the public imagination. He was not remembered as a frenzied attacker lurking in alleyways. He was remembered as a man who could sit calmly in a hotel lounge, order drinks confidently, flirt effortlessly, and then commit acts of horrifying cruelty behind closed doors. In retrospect, there is something deeply symbolic about the timing of the case. Britain had just emerged from a war defined by visible destruction, bombed buildings, air raids, soldiers marching through ruined cities. Violence during wartime often appeared distant yet obvious. But the violence Neville Heath represented was intimate, personal, hidden beneath ordinary social interaction. His crimes introduced a different kind of fear into post-war society, the fear that danger could be sitting beside you at a bar, speaking politely, wearing medals, and smiling. The investigation that followed would reveal layers of deception extending far beyond the murders themselves. Heath had a history of impersonation, fraud, manipulation, and fabricated identities. He moved through society like an actor changing costumes, depending on what the moment required. Yet despite all the lies, there remained one horrifying consistency in the testimony of those who encountered him: his calmness. Witnesses repeatedly described the same unnerving composure, even after violence, even under suspicion, even after arrest. It was as though maintaining the performance mattered to him as much as anything else. And that calmness would become one of the most disturbing elements of the entire case. Because while evidence revealed terrible brutality behind closed doors, Neville Heath himself rarely appeared emotional or unstable in public. He appeared controlled, measured, sometimes even charming. That contradiction haunted investigators, journalists, and later criminal psychologists who examined the case. How could someone capable of such sadistic violence present himself so normally moments later? How could someone move through luxury hotels and social gatherings while concealing acts of unimaginable cruelty? Those questions would follow the case from the first murder scene all the way to the courtroom. But before Britain learned the full extent of Neville Heath's crimes, before newspapers printed his face across front pages, before the trial transformed him into one of the most infamous killers of the post-war era, there were two women whose lives intersected with his performance at the worst possible moment. Two women who encountered not the public image, but the reality hidden underneath it. And to understand how Neville Heath became one of the most feared murderers in Britain after the war, it is necessary to begin not with the headlines, but with a world that allowed him to blend in so easily, a society exhausted by conflict, eager to trust again, and vulnerable to a man who understood exactly how to exploit that trust. To understand how Neville Heath was able to move through post-war Britain unnoticed for so long, it is necessary to understand the country itself in 1946. The Second World War had officially ended, but emotionally, Britain was still living in its shadow. Entire cities carried scars from German bombing campaigns. Families across the country were grieving fathers, sons, daughters, and husbands who would never return. Food rationing continued even after peace had been declared. Economic uncertainty lingered everywhere. Yet despite the exhaustion, There was also an overwhelming desire to reclaim ordinary life. Cafes reopened, dance halls filled with music again. Hotels welcomed travelers who wanted, even briefly, to forget the years of fear that had dominated everyday existence. The war had reshaped social relationships in profound ways. Millions of people had spent years separated from loved ones. Men returned home changed by combat and trauma. Women who had entered wartime industries found themselves navigating a society shifting once again. Beneath their feet, in that uncertain environment, social rituals became important. People wanted romance, excitement, companionship, and distraction. A handsome man in military uniform represented all of those things at once. During the war, uniforms had become symbols of courage and sacrifice. Officers especially were often treated with admiration and automatic trust. Questions were rarely asked. If a man claimed distinguished military service, most people accepted it immediately. And Neville Heath understood exactly how powerful that trust could be. Heath had spent years perfecting the art of becoming whoever people wanted him to be. Born in 1917 into a middle-class English family, Neville George Cleveley Heath did not begin life as a visibly monstrous figure. Nothing in his appearance warned others about the violence he would later commit. In fact, many who met him initially found him charming. That ability to create positive first impressions became central to the danger he posed. Account from his early life already suggested troubling behavioral patterns. He developed a reputation for compulsive lying at a young age. Not ordinary childhood exaggeration, but elaborate fabrications designed to manipulate how others perceived him. He enjoyed inventing stories, exaggerating achievements, and creating false identities that made him appear more important, more sophisticated, or more powerful than he truly was. At school, those tendencies were accompanied by disciplinary problems. He was repeatedly punished for theft and violent behavior. Yet even then, there was an unsettling contradiction in his personality. Heath could behave aggressively and deceptively while still appearing socially polished. He learned early that confidence often protected him from suspicion. A convincing performance could override concern. That lesson would follow him into adulthood. As Britain entered the chaos of World War II, he found an environment perfectly suited to someone skilled in deception. Wartime created constant movement. Soldiers transferred between cities and military bases. Civilians encountered strangers every day. Record-keeping systems were strained. Verifying personal histories quickly became difficult. In such conditions, a man willing to lie convincingly could reinvent himself repeatedly. Heath served in the military during the war, but the image he projected to others often went far beyond reality. According to later investigations, he regularly impersonated higher-ranking officers and wore medals that did not belong to him. He crafted an image of aristocratic confidence and heroic wartime service. To strangers, he appeared successful, educated, and worldly. Witnesses consistently described him as articulate and self-assured. He spoke elegantly. He carried himself with precision. He understood the social power of appearance. This ability to perform became especially effective in post-war nightlife culture. In cities like London and Bournemouth, bars and hotels were full of people seeking relief from years of hardship. Conversations moved quickly. Relationships formed rapidly. The atmosphere of uncertainty created opportunities for predators skilled at manipulation. He thrived in that environment. He checked into expensive hotels he could not truly afford. He surrounded himself with symbols of status. He introduced himself as a wealthy military officer connected to powerful people. And because his appearance matched the story, many believed him immediately. It is important to remember that in 1946 Britain, confidence itself carried enormous persuasive power. Heath did not present himself as threatening. He presented himself as reassuring. He embodied the image of post-war sophistication people desperately wanted to believe still existed. Behind that carefully maintained persona, however, there were already warning signs. Investigators later uncovered patterns of fraud, deception, and abusive behavior toward women. Heath used aliases frequently. He manipulated finances. He exploited trust wherever he found it. Yet the deeper pattern connecting all these behaviors was control. He appeared obsessed with domination, over situations, over identities, over how others perceived him. The murders that would later shock Britain did not emerge from nowhere. They existed at the extreme end of a broader pattern of manipulation and emotional detachment that had shaped much of Heath's adult life. Still, before the crimes, most people who encountered him would never have imagined the violence hidden beneath the surface. That gap between appearance and reality became one of the defining horrors of the case. By June 1946, Heath was moving comfortably through London social circles, presenting himself as a distinguished Royal Air Force officer. It was during this period that he encountered Marjorie Gardner. Unlike the sensationalized image often created around victims in historical crime reporting, Gardner was not simply a name attached to a police file. She was a real person living through the same uncertain post-war world as everyone else around her. Approximately 32 years old and working in the entertainment industry, she existed within a social environment where meeting new people in clubs, restaurants, and hotels was not unusual. London nightlife after the war had become a strange mixture of celebration and exhaustion. People saw connection because so much had been lost. In that atmosphere, someone like Heath could appear deeply attractive. He projected confidence during a period of instability. He appeared elegant in a city still carrying physical scars from bombing. He told stories of military service at a time when soldiers were admired almost automatically. When Gardner met Heath, there was little reason for her to immediately suspect danger. Witnesses later recalled Heath presenting himself exactly as he always did: polished, wealthy, sophisticated, and important. His social confidence appears to have been central to the rapid trust he created. That trust would ultimately place Gardner in catastrophic danger. But before she became known publicly as a murder victim, she was simply another woman attempting to navigate life in post-war London, a city full of strangers reinventing themselves after years of destruction. The same was true of Doreen Marshall, though her story carried an even greater sense of youth interrupted. Marshall was only 21 years old. She belonged to a younger generation emerging into adulthood just as the war ended. For people her age, peace represented possibility. Britain's seaside towns and nightlife districts became gathering places for young adults trying to experience freedom after years dominated by conflict and restriction. Bournemouth, where Marshall later encountered Heath, reflected that atmosphere. Hotels and pubs were filled with servicemen, tourists, workers, and travelers attempting to rediscover normal life. To meet a confident military officer in such an environment would not have seemed alarming. In fact, it may have seemed ordinary. That normality is what makes the case so deeply unsettling in retrospect. Heath did not hunt in dark alleys or isolate himself from society. He moved directly through ordinary social spaces. He relied on conversation, charm, and appearance rather than overt intimidation. Both Gardner and Marshall encountered him in environments associated with leisure and social interaction, not immediate danger. That detail matters because it highlights how effectively Heath weaponized trust. He understood how to appear safe. He understood the cultural authority attached to military identity. He understood how easily politeness and sophistication could disarm suspicion. The public response after the murders revealed how deeply that contradiction disturbed Britain. Violent criminals were expected to look dangerous. Heath did not. Witnesses remembered his manners as vividly as they remembered his arrogance. Investigators noted his composure repeatedly. Journalists covering the case later became fascinated by the contrast between his appearance and his. Kemp. Yet beneath that fascination was a broader social fear beginning to emerge. If someone like Neville Heath could hide such brutality behind elegance and confidence, then perhaps appearances themselves could no longer be trusted. The country that had just survived a world war now found itself confronting a different kind of threat. Not an enemy in uniform marching openly through Europe, but a predator capable of blending invisibly into everyday life. And as investigators would soon discover, the violence associated with Neville Heath was not impulsive or chaotic. It carried signs of planning, control, and emotional detachment. The carefully maintained image of the charming officer was not separate from crimes. It was part of how the crimes became possible. His ability to manipulate perception allowed him access to victims, freedom of movement, and protection from suspicion. The persona was not merely a disguise. It was a weapon. By the summer of 1946, Britain still believed it had emerged from its darkest chapter. But in hotel rooms and quiet nightlife districts, another horror was already unfolding, one built not on bombs or battlefields, but on deception, cruelty, and the terrifying realization that evil could wear a polished smile. By the summer of 1946, Neville Heath had already perfected the identity he wanted the world to see. He moved through hotels, bars, and social spaces with the confidence of a man who believed he could control every situation he entered. Witnesses described him as polished and self-assured, the kind of person who immediately attracted attention in a crowded room. He understood how to perform sophistication convincingly enough that most people never questioned him. In post-war Britain, where uniforms still carried enormous social authority, Heath's carefully crafted image gave him immediate credibility. He knew how to use that credibility to gain trust quickly, especially from women. The first known victim to encounter that performance in its deadliest form was Marjorie Gardner. In June 1946, Gardner met Heath in London. The exact details of their first conversation were never fully reconstructed, but investigators later understood the broad pattern clearly because Heath repeated it again and again. He introduced himself as a wealthy Royal Air Force officer, a man connected to influence and status. He projected refinement. He appeared educated and worldly. To someone meeting him socially, there was little visible reason to feel alarmed. London nightlife, after the war, encouraged rapid social interaction. People met in restaurants, bars, clubs, and hotel lounges every evening. Conversations that might once have felt reckless now seemed ordinary in a city trying to reclaim pleasure after years dominated by fear. Gardner, who worked in entertainment and moved within social environments where confidence and charm mattered, encountered Heath under exactly those circumstances. What makes the events that followed so disturbing is how ordinary they likely appeared at first. Two adults checking into a hotel together in Kensington would not have attracted unusual attention. Hotels in post-war London were filled with travelers and couples. Staff members observed guests constantly, but most interactions passed without scrutiny. Heath understood this environment perfectly. He relied on the anonymity of urban life and the reluctance of strangers to interfere in private matters. Sometime after Gardner and Heath entered the hotel room together, witnesses later reported hearing disturbances during the night. Raised voices, unusual sounds, indications that something violent or frightening may have been happening behind the closed door. Yet nobody intervened. In fairness, that hesitation reflected the culture of the time. People were accustomed to ignoring arguments between couples or disturbances in hotel rooms. After surviving years of wartime trauma, many individuals had developed habits of emotional distance. Unless violence became impossible to ignore, people often convinced themselves not to become involved. That silence would later become one of the haunting elements surrounding the case. Behind the walls of an expensive London hotel room, Marjorie Gardner was subjected to extraordinary violence. The injuries later documented by investigators revealed not a sudden outburst, but a prolonged and deeply sadistic assault. Gardner had been severely beaten. Her body showed marks consistent with whipping or striking. There were extensive signs of sexual violence. She had been bitten with such force that investigators considered the injuries especially disturbing, even by the standards of violent crime investigations. Ultimately, she was strangled. What horrified investigators was not only the extent of the injuries, but the evidence suggesting sustained control throughout the attack. The violence appeared deliberate rather than chaotic. Gardner had not simply been killed quickly during an argument or robbery. The injuries indicated prolonged suffering. Detectives examining the scene quickly recognized signs associated with extreme sexual sadism. Yet even more unsettling was the apparent calmness visible afterward. The room itself did not suggest panic. Certain details indicated the killer had remained composed after Gardner's death. Instead of fleeing immediately in terror or confusion, Heath appeared capable of regaining control, cleaning aspects of the scene, and leaving in an orderly manner. That emotional detachment transformed the case from a brutal homicide into something psychologically darker. Investigators began confronting the possibility that the killer derived a sense of control or gratification from the violence itself. The contrast between the elegant surroundings and the brutality inside the room deeply affected public reaction once details emerged. Kensington represented sophistication and upper-class respectability. The idea that such extreme violence had unfolded quietly inside a luxury hotel room intensified the sense of vulnerability spreading through London. And while police began piecing together evidence connected to Gardner's murder, Neville Heath continued moving through society almost normally. That period after the first killing would later disturb investigators nearly as much as the murder itself. Heath did not disappear into hiding. He did not appear consumed by fear or guilt. Instead, accounts suggest he continued socializing, maintaining appearances, and presenting himself confidently in public spaces. The absence of visible remorse became one of the defining characteristics repeatedly noted by those who encountered him. To observers, he still appeared polished and controlled. There was no outward indication that he had recently committed an act of horrifying violence. That ability to compartmentalize became central to understanding the danger Heath represented. For many violent offenders, crimes produce panic, instability, or reckless mistakes immediately afterward. But Heath appeared emotionally detached enough to preserve his public persona almost effortlessly. The murder of Marjorie Gardner was not an endpoint. It was an escalation. And within weeks, Heath encountered another young woman who would become the second known victim linked to his violence. 21-year-old Doreen Marshall. Marshall's age made the second crime especially devastating to the public once details became known. She represented a younger generation entering adulthood just as the war ended. A generation attempting to rebuild ordinary lives after years of global destruction. Bournemouth, where she met Heath, was known as a seaside town filled with hotels, pubs, and nightlife. In the summer of 1946, it attracted tourists, servicemen, and young adults seeking entertainment and escape. It was exactly the kind of environment where Heath's fabricated military persona thrived. He met Marshall at a pub, once again presenting himself as a sophisticated officer with wealth and status. By this point, the pattern had become unmistakable, though only in retrospect. Heath relied on confidence and appearance rather than force during first encounters. He did not initially appear threatening. He created attraction and trust before violence entered the situation. Witnesses later remembered him because he carried himself with unusual assurance. He dressed carefully. He spoke convincingly. He enjoyed attention. Marshall eventually accompanied him to the Albany Hotel. At the time, there was nothing publicly alarming about that decision. In post-war Britain, countless social encounters followed similar patterns every night. But sometime after entering Heath's orbit, Marshall disappeared. When her body was eventually discovered near roadside bushes, the full horror of the second murder became clear. Like Gardner, Marshall had suffered extensive violence before death. Her body was found nude. Investigators documented signs of severe assault and torture. There were indications she had been beaten with a hard object. Bite marks and scratches covered parts of her body. Ultimately, as with Gardner, the cause of death was strangulation. Medical examination suggested prolonged suffering before death occurred. The similarities between the two murders immediately alarmed investigators. Both victims were women approached socially. Both encountered Heath through environments associated with leisure and nightlife. Both suffered extreme sexual violence combined with physical assault and strangulation. And in both cases, the offender appeared capable of remaining calm afterward. Yet there were also signs of escalation. The second murder carried a level of confidence, suggesting Heath no longer feared detection in the same way. Moving Marshall's body away from the hotel environment introduced a different level of risk and control. The brutality inflicted upon her reinforced investigators' growing belief that the violence itself was central to the offender's psychological gratification. Public reaction to Marshall's murder intensified rapidly because the case no longer appeared isolated. Britain had already been shaken by Gardner's death. Now a second young woman had been found murdered under similarly horrifying circumstances. Newspapers increasingly focused on the idea that a sadistic predator was moving through social spaces unnoticed. Women reading those reports recognized how ordinary the encounters initially appeared. Meeting a military officer at a pub did not sound dangerous. Accepting drinks from a charming stranger did not sound extraordinary. The randomness of the victim's interactions with Heath created widespread anxiety because it suggested vulnerability could emerge during completely ordinary social situations. Investigators, meanwhile, became increasingly focused on behavioral patterns rather than isolated forensic details alone. Heath's crimes revealed someone obsessed with performance and control. He used sophistication strategically. He selected environments where appearances mattered. Luxury hotels, polished conversation, military imagery, all functioned as part of the same mechanism. The murders were not separate from the persona. The persona enabled the murders. That realization would later become critical during the investigation because witnesses remembered Heath so vividly. Unlike offenders who avoided attention, Heath often attracted it intentionally. He wanted people to notice him. His ego repeatedly exposed him to observation. Hotel staff remembered the confident officer boasting about military service. Pub patrons recalled the well-dressed stranger dominating conversations. His need for admiration ultimately made him easier to trace. But before police fully connected the two murders, before the public learned the full extent of Heath's deception, Britain was already beginning to confront a terrifying idea. The war may have ended, but another kind of predator had been moving invisibly through the fragile peace that followed. And unlike the violence people had survived during wartime, this danger wore elegance like camouflage. When detectives began comparing the murders of Marjorie Gardner and Doreen Marshall, the similarities were impossible to ignore. Both women had encountered a man presenting himself as a sophisticated military officer. Both had entered social environments with him voluntarily, believing they were in the company of someone respectable and successful. Both had been subjected to prolonged sexual violence and brutal physical assault before being strangled. And perhaps most chilling of all, Both crimes carried signs that the killer remained calm and methodical afterward. In 1946, British police forces were still adapting to the realities of post-war crime. The country itself had changed dramatically during the war years. Millions of people had traveled constantly between cities, military bases, hospitals, and ports. Identities had become difficult to verify quickly. Men in uniform moved through society almost anonymously. Investigators now faced a murderer who understood those conditions perfectly and exploited them with precision. The challenge for detectives was not simply finding a violent offender. It was identifying a man who had built his entire adult life around deception. The first major breakthrough came from witness memory. Heath's greatest advantage had also become a weakness. He attracted attention wherever he went. Hotel staff remembered him because he dressed too elegantly to disappear into the background. Bartenders recalled his confidence and military stories. Guests noticed the polished man who carried himself like someone important. Unlike offenders who avoided social contact, Heath enjoyed being observed. He wanted admiration. He cultivated it deliberately. Detectives working the Gardner case began retracing the victim's final known movements through hotel records and witness statements. In post-war Britain, hotels routinely documented guest names, though verification standards were often inconsistent. Heath relied heavily on that weakness. He used aliases frequently and shifted identities depending on the situation. Yet despite the false names, witnesses repeatedly described the same personality traits. A charming military officer, articulate and self-assured, speaking confidently about wartime service and elite connections. As investigators gathered more testimony, a behavioral profile slowly emerged. The killer appeared socially skilled rather than isolated. He targeted women in nightlife environments. He preferred expensive or respectable locations that reinforced his image of sophistication. Most importantly, he seemed deeply invested in maintaining control over how others perceived him. That observation became increasingly important once detectives connected the Gardner and Marshall murders. In both cases, the offender relied on social trust before violence occurred. This was not random street violence. It was calculated manipulation. Detectives soon realized they were dealing with someone who understood appearance as a form of camouflage. The second murder intensified investigative urgency dramatically. Doreen Marshall's body had been discovered near roadside bushes after she disappeared following a meeting with Heath in Bournemouth. The brutality of the attack created enormous public pressure on police. Newspapers increasingly framed the killings as evidence of a sadistic predator moving through post-war Britain unnoticed. Fear spread, especially among women, because the circumstances surrounding the murders felt terrifyingly ordinary. The victims had not entered visibly dangerous situations. They had encountered a man who appeared respectable. As investigators reviewed witness accounts from Bournemouth, the same pattern appeared again and again. Heath had introduced himself using military credentials. He had spoken confidently about status and influence. He had socialized comfortably in public before Marshall disappeared. Employees at the Albany Hotel remembered him clearly. Witnesses at pubs recalled the well-dressed officer attracting attention easily. The investigation gradually shifted from isolated forensic evidence toward a broader reconstruction of Heath's movements and social behavior. Detectives understood they were pursuing someone who relied heavily on public performance. That meant every interaction potentially left witnesses behind. One of the most important aspects of the investigation involved tracing Heath's false identities. Investigators discovered that deception shaped nearly every aspect of his life. He used multiple names. He fabricated military achievements. He manipulated financial systems. He presented himself differently depending on the audience he faced. The deeper detectives looked, The more they found patterns of fraud and impersonation extending far beyond the murders themselves. Heath had spent years constructing versions of himself designed to exploit trust quickly. Yet his own ego repeatedly undermined his efforts at invisibility. He liked attention too much. Witnesses remembered him because he wanted to be memorable. He boasted. He exaggerated. He cultivated admiration constantly. In many ways, Heath behaved less like a man hiding from society and more like a performer demanding recognition from it. That need for attention became one of the investigation's most valuable tools. Detectives began connecting witness statements across multiple locations. The elegant military officer described in London sounded remarkably similar to the man seen in Bournemouth. Details aligned consistently. The polished appearance, the confidence, the habit of discussing military service, the expensive tastes, the commanding social presence. Gradually, investigators narrowed their focus on Neville Heath himself. By the time police moved to arrest him, public anxiety surrounding the case had become intense. Britain 1946 was already emotionally exhausted from years of war. The idea that a sadistic killer had been moving through ordinary social spaces using charm as a weapon created a particularly deep fear. Unlike wartime violence, which came from distant enemies and visible destruction, Heath represented intimate danger hidden inside everyday life. The arrest itself would later become one of the most discussed moments in the entire case because of Heath's behavior. When police finally confronted him, he reportedly remained remarkably calm. Witnesses described him as composed, polite, and carefully dressed, even under suspicion for brutal murders. Heath maintained the persona he had spent years constructing. He reportedly wore military attire and behaved with the confidence of someone still trying to control the room around him. Investigators found that composure deeply unsettling. Many violent offenders display panic, denial, emotional collapse, or rage once captured. Heath appeared detached, almost theatrical in his self-control. During searches connected to the investigation, police uncovered further disturbing evidence about his life and behavior. Authorities found items associated with sadomasochistic practices, reinforcing suspicions that the violence inflicted upon Gardner and Marshall reflected deliberate sexual sadism rather than impulsive rage. Investigators also uncovered evidence of financial fraud and deceptive activity tied to his multiple false identities. Reports suggested a broader history of manipulative and abusive behavior toward women as well. Piece by piece, detectives assembled the portrait of a man who used charm not merely as social strategy, but as a mechanism for domination. The interrogation process only deepened investigators' unease. Heath reportedly showed very little visible remorse. He remained emotionally controlled during questioning, even while facing evidence connected to the murders. Detectives were struck repeatedly by the disconnect between the horrifying violence of the crimes and the calm demeanor of the man accused of committing them. That emotional absence became one of the defining psychological impressions left by the case. Heath did not appear haunted by guilt in the way many people expected murderers to appear. Instead, he projected the same composed confidence witnesses had described before the killings became public. For investigators, this raised deeply troubling questions. How could someone capable of such brutality maintain such composure? Was the calmness itself part of the violence, another form of control? The murders had already revealed someone fascinated by domination and suffering. Now detectives confronted a suspect who appeared disturbingly unaffected by the human consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, the British press transformed the investigation into national obsession. Newspapers emphasized the contradiction at the heart of the case. The polished military gentleman accused of monstrous cruelty. The phrase, "gentleman killer," began appearing in headlines. capturing the public's fascination and horror simultaneously. Journalists focused heavily on Heath's appearance because it challenged public assumptions about criminality. He did not resemble the stereotype of a violent predator. He looked sophisticated, respectable, civilized. That contradiction amplified public fear because it suggested evil could move invisibly through ordinary society. Women across Britain read details about Gardner and Marshall with growing anxiety. The victims had met Heath in familiar environments, pubs, hotels, nightlife spaces considered socially acceptable. The randomness of those encounters made the crimes feel disturbingly relatable. Parents warned daughters to be cautious around strangers claiming military prestige. Hotels and nightlife establishments faced uncomfortable scrutiny regarding how easily offenders could exploit public trust. The case also exposed weaknesses in post-war identity verification systems. Heath's ability to move between cities using false names and fabricated military status revealed how chaotic Britain remained after the war. The country's administrative systems were still recovering from years of disruption, and predators capable of manipulation could exploit those weaknesses effectively. Yet despite Heath's elaborate performances, the investigation ultimately succeeded because human memory proved stronger than deception. Witness after witness remembered the same details, the same confidence, the same arrogance, the same polished officer demanding attention in public spaces. Ironically, the very qualities Heath used to dominate social environments ultimately made him identifiable. His ego prevented invisibility. He wanted admiration too much to disappear quietly. As preparations for trial began, Britain's attention shifted from the mystery of identifying the killer to a different question entirely. How could a man who appeared so controlled and civilized commit acts of such extraordinary cruelty? The courtroom would soon become the stage where that contradiction played out publicly in front of the entire nation. By the time Neville Heath entered the courtroom in 1946, Britain was already consumed by the case. Newspapers across the country had transformed the murders of Marjorie Gardner and Doreen Marshall into a national fixation. The public was horrified not only by the brutality of the crimes, but by the image of the man accused of committing them. Heath did not resemble the kind of killer people expected to fear. He was articulate, polished, and outwardly composed. Journalists repeatedly emphasized his appearance because it challenged society's assumptions about violence. The press described him as elegant, confident, even charismatic. Yet behind that carefully maintained image stood allegations of prolonged torture, sexual sadism, and calculated murder. The contradiction fascinated the public and disturbed investigators in equal measure. Courtrooms in post-war Britain often reflected a society still recovering from years of trauma. But the atmosphere surrounding Heath's trial carried a different intensity. People were not simply watching a murder prosecution. They were trying to understand how someone who appeared civilized could commit acts of such extraordinary cruelty. The trial quickly became more than a legal proceeding. It became a confrontation between outward respectability and hidden violence, between social appearance and human reality. Crowds gathered to follow every development. Newspapers published detailed reports describing Heath's demeanor, the evidence against him, and the disturbing testimony surrounding the deaths of Gardner and Marshall. The prosecution's case centered on demonstrating that Heath's crimes were deliberate, organized, and fully understood by the man committing them. Prosecutors argued that this was not uncontrolled madness erupting suddenly in moments of confusion. Instead, they presented Heath as a manipulative predator who carefully constructed false identities in order to gain access to victims. The pattern connecting the murders became one of the strongest elements of the prosecution's argument. Both women had encountered Heath through ordinary social interaction. Both had been deceived by his fabricated military persona. Both had been subjected to extreme violence before death, and in both cases, the offender appeared calm and methodical afterward. Prosecutors emphasized Heath's repeated use of aliases and military impersonation. He had not wandered accidentally into these situations. He actively built false identities designed to create trust. He wore medals that were not his. He exaggerated military achievements. He cultivated admiration deliberately. According to the prosecution, those deceptions revealed planning and awareness. Heath understood exactly how his performance affected others, and he used that understanding strategically. Witness testimony became crucial in establishing this portrait of calculated manipulation. Hotel employees described the confident officer who checked into respectable establishments without hesitation. Pub witnesses recalled Heath boasting about military service and attracting attention easily. Staff members remembered his polished appearance and commanding social presence. Rather than hiding from scrutiny, Heath often seemed to enjoy it. The prosecution used those details to argue that Heath consciously cultivated a persona capable of disarming suspicion. The murders themselves provided further evidence of deliberation. Investigators described the extensive injuries inflicted upon both victims. The violence was not momentary or chaotic. Medical evidence suggested prolonged assaults involving physical abuse, sexual violence, and strangulation. Prosecutors argued that the nature of the injuries demonstrated sustained control rather than impulsive rage. Heath's calmness after the crimes became another major focus. In both cases, there were indications the offender remained composed enough to leave scenes without panic. The prosecution portrayed this emotional detachment as evidence of consciousness and intent rather than insanity. At the center of the defense strategy was a very different interpretation of Heath's behavior. Defense lawyers attempted to argue that Heath suffered from severe psychological disturbance, connected to violent sexual impulses beyond his control, rather than presenting him as a coldly calculating predator. They sought to portray him as mentally unstable and driven by uncontrollable compulsions. The argument reflected broader legal tensions common in violent crime cases. Where exactly should society draw the line between criminal responsibility and psychological dysfunction? Yet the prosecution repeatedly countered by pointing to Heath's organized behavior before and after the murders. He used false names systematically. He manipulated appearances carefully. He selected victims socially. He concealed aspects of his identity. He maintained composure after acts of extraordinary violence. According to prosecutors, those actions demonstrated awareness and planning incompatible with total loss of control. One of the most unsettling aspects of the trial was Heath himself. Observers repeatedly commented on his demeanor inside the courtroom. Even while evidence of brutal violence was presented publicly, Heath reportedly remained strikingly calm. Journalists covering the proceedings described him as composed and emotionally detached. Some reports suggested he smiled during portions of the trial. Others noted that he appeared more interested in maintaining his image than responding emotionally to the horrifying testimony surrounding the deaths of Gardner and Marshall. Perhaps most disturbing were reports that Heath flirted with female reporters covering the case. Whether driven by arrogance, emotional emptiness, or compulsive performance, the behavior deeply unsettled public observers. Here was a man accused of horrific violence against women behaving as though the courtroom itself were another stage for charm and manipulation. For many people following the trial, that behavior reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of Heath as someone fundamentally detached from the suffering of others. The emotional absence visible during proceedings became almost as frightening as the evidence itself. Witnesses describing the injuries inflicted upon Gardner and Marshall faced a courtroom audience. struggling to reconcile the brutality of the crimes with the polished figure sitting calmly nearby. The disconnect between appearance and reality haunted every stage of the trial. In many ways, Heath's behavior reflected the same contradictions investigators had encountered from the beginning. He seemed deeply invested in performance, even while facing the possibility of execution. The courtroom became an extension of the social environments where he had previously manipulated. Perception. He dressed carefully. He maintained composure. He projected confidence. Yet surrounding him now were details exposing the violence hidden behind that image. As testimony continued, public fascination increasingly shifted toward broader questions about personality and evil. The British public had endured years of wartime violence. But Heath represented something psychologically different. His crimes were intimate rather than distant, personal rather than ideological. He had not killed in battle or political conflict. He had used trust itself as a weapon. The trial forced many people to confront the possibility that outward sophistication could coexist with profound cruelty. Eventually, after hearing the evidence presented by both sides, the jury reached its conclusion. Neville Heath was found guilty of murder. The verdict brought a sense of relief to a public deeply disturbed by the case. Yet the relief was incomplete. The crimes themselves remained difficult to comprehend. Newspapers described widespread horror not only at the violence inflicted upon Gardner and Marshall, but at Heath's apparent emotional indifference throughout the proceedings. For many observers, the trial answered the legal question of guilt while leaving deeper psychological questions unresolved. Following conviction, Heath was sentenced to death. In 1946 Britain, capital punishment remained a legal response to murder, and executions were carried out by hanging. Heath would spend the final period of his life awaiting execution at Pentonville Prison in London. Even during that final stage, accounts continued emphasizing his unusual calmness. Witnesses later described Heath maintaining composure right up until the end. On October 16, 1946, Neville Heath was executed by hanging at Pentonville. Reports from those present suggested he remained outwardly controlled in his final moments. One detail especially captured public attention afterward. Heath reportedly took time to adjust his clothing carefully before walking to the execution chamber. To many observers, that final gesture symbolized the entire disturbing contradiction surrounding the case. Even facing death, Heath appeared focused on presentation and appearance. The performance continued until the very end. In the aftermath of the execution, Britain was left grappling with a case that seemed to expose uncomfortable truths about violence and deception. Heath became permanently associated with the image of the gentleman killer, a phrase that reflected both public fascination and cultural anxiety. The murders of Marjorie Gardner and Doreen Marshall had revealed how easily charm, confidence, and social status could conceal predatory behavior. The courtroom proceedings had exposed not only the brutality of Heath's crimes, but also the unsettling emptiness with which he appeared to confront them. For many people, the most frightening aspect of Neville Heath was not rage or madness visible on the surface. It was the terrifying normality of the mask he wore while carrying out extraordinary violence behind closed doors. After Neville Heath was executed at Pentonville Prison on October 16, 1946, Britain attempted to move on. Officially, the case was over. The man responsible for the murders of Marjorie Gardner and Doreen Marshall was dead. The investigation had concluded, the trial had ended, and the legal system had delivered its final judgment. Yet some crimes continue living long after courtrooms empty and newspaper headlines fade. The Heath case became one of those stories, not simply because of the brutality involved, but because of what the murders revealed about fear, trust, and human deception in post-war Britain. In the years that followed, Neville Heath remained one of the most infamous killers associated with the period immediately after World War II. His name survived in criminal history not only because he murdered, but because he shattered assumptions about what violence was supposed to look like. Britain in 1946 was a nation emotionally exhausted from visible destruction. People understood bombs, uniforms, and enemies marching openly across Europe. What they struggled to understand was a predator capable of blending seamlessly into ordinary social life while hiding extreme cruelty behind charm and sophistication. The image that remained in public memory was deeply unsettling: a handsome, articulate man wearing military attire, speaking politely in hotel lounges and bars, then committing acts of horrifying violence behind closed doors. The phrase, "gentleman killer," endured because it captured the contradiction that disturbed society. Most profoundly, Heath did not appear monstrous. He appeared respectable, and that distinction changed the way many people thought about danger itself. Before the case, there remained a comforting tendency to believe violent offenders could somehow be recognized immediately through appearance or social class. Heath challenged that illusion completely. He demonstrated how effectively manipulation could operate beneath outward refinement. The murders of Marjorie Gardner and Doreen Marshall forced Britain to confront an uncomfortable reality. Trust could be weaponized. The post-war environment had helped create conditions where someone like Heath could move unnoticed. Military uniforms commanded admiration. Confidence inspired trust. Hotels and nightlife venues became spaces where strangers connected quickly in a society desperate for normality after years of war. Heath exploited all of it. He understood that people often judge character through appearance, status, and charm. He relied on those assumptions repeatedly. In the aftermath of the trial, criminal investigators and later criminologists increasingly examined Heath as an example of predatory manipulation hidden beneath social performance. Observers repeatedly focused on the same traits documented throughout the investigation and courtroom proceedings: superficial charm, emotional detachment, compulsive deception, and an apparent desire for domination. Reports emphasized his lack of visible remorse and his ability to maintain composure even while evidence of extraordinary violence was discussed publicly. To many experts studying violent criminal behavior later, Heath represented the terrifying possibility that cruelty and social sophistication could coexist comfortably inside the same person. Yet it is important not to lose sight of the victims within that fascination. One of the dangers in historical true crime is allowing the offender's personality to dominate the story completely while the victims slowly disappear into the background. The legacy of the Heath case should not belong only to the man who committed the violence. At the center of the tragedy were two women whose lives ended in unimaginable circumstances. Marjorie Gardner was more than the victim discovered in a Kensington hotel room. She was a woman living through the uncertainty of post-war London, working in entertainment, navigating a society trying to recover from years of destruction. Doreen Marshall was only 21 years old, part of the younger generation stepping into adulthood just as peace returned to Britain. Both women encountered someone who appeared safe, respectable, and even attractive within the social expectations of their time. Neither could have known the reality hidden behind Heath's carefully constructed identity. Their stories became national headlines because of the violence inflicted upon them. But their humanity existed long before they became names associated with a murder trial. Remembering that humanity matters because cases like this often reveal how easily public fascination can shift toward the offender's psychology while overlooking the ordinary lives interrupted by predatory violence. The impact of the Heath case extended beyond public fear and media attention. Investigators later recognized that the murders exposed important weaknesses in how violent sexual, crimes were approached in post-war Britain. The case reinforced the importance of identifying behavioral patterns across multiple incidents, rather than treating murders in isolation. Detectives had connected Heath to the crimes partly because they recognized recurring methods. The manipulation of victims through false military identity, the use of hotels and nightlife environments, the combination of sexual violence and strangulation, and the offender's calmness afterward. Those investigative observations contributed to broader changes in how police approached repeat violent offenders in the years that followed. The murders also highlighted vulnerabilities created by post-war administrative confusion. Heath's repeated use of aliases and fabricated military status exposed how easily identity systems could be manipulated during a period of national disruption. In a country filled with returning soldiers, temporary housing, and constant travel, someone skilled in deception could exploit social trust remarkably effectively. That realization carried broader implications beyond the Heath case itself. It forced authorities to think more carefully about identity verification, background investigation, and the social authority automatically granted to uniforms and status symbols. Yet even decades later, what continues haunting discussions of Neville Heath is not merely the mechanics of the crimes, but the emotional contradiction surrounding him. Witnesses consistently describe the same qualities: calmness, charm, sophistication, confidence. Those traits were not separate from the violence. They enabled it. Heath's ability to appear civilized gave him access to victims and protection from suspicion. The case became a disturbing reminder that danger does not always announce itself openly. Some predators survive precisely because they understand how reassuring appearances can become a form of camouflage. Modern audiences looking back at the Heath murders may be tempted to search for clear psychological explanations or dramatic revelations capable of simplifying the case into something easier to understand. But one of the most unsettling aspects of the story is how resistant it remains to comforting conclusions. There is no sudden transformation from ordinary citizen into obvious monster. No moment where society collectively recognized the danger before violence occurred. Instead, there was a gradual pattern of deception, manipulation, and escalating cruelty hidden behind social confidence. Heath performed normality successfully enough that many people trusted him instinctively. That reality remains deeply disturbing because it undermines the comforting belief that evil is always visible in advance. The media coverage surrounding the case also revealed something uncomfortable about public fascination itself. Newspapers became obsessed with Heath's appearance and demeanor, often emphasizing his elegance almost as much as his crimes. Some coverage seemed captivated by the contradiction of the attractive killer. Yet beneath that fascination was genuine cultural anxiety. The public did not merely fear Heath because he was violent. They feared him because he looked trustworthy while committing violence. In many ways, the enduring power of the case comes from that exact contradiction. It forces people to question the reliability of instinct, status, and appearance. It reveals how social performance can obscure reality. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us how vulnerable societies become during periods of collective exhaustion and emotional instability. Britain 1946 desperately wanted normal life again. People wanted glamour, romance, confidence, and distraction after years dominated by death and uncertainty. Heath exploited those desires skillfully. He understood how badly people wanted to believe in reassuring appearances. In the end, the story of Neville Heath is not only about murder. It is about manipulation, performance, and the terrifying gap that can exist between public identity and private behavior. It is about the danger of assuming refinement equals morality. It is about how violence sometimes hides itself behind politeness and charm rather than rage and intimidation. And above all, it is a reminder that the victims at the center of these stories were real people whose lives intersected with deception at the worst possible moment. Marjorie Gardner and Doreen Marshall entered ordinary social situations in a country attempting to heal from war. They encountered a man society encouraged them to trust, a confident officer, well-dressed, articulate, seemingly respectable. What happened afterward would become one of the darkest criminal cases of post-war Britain, not only because of the brutality involved, but because it exposed something far more unsettling than visible violence. The possibility that evil can sometimes look completely ordinary until the moment it reveals itself, even after the execution of Neville Heath. The atmosphere surrounding the case did not disappear quickly from British memory. Some murder cases fade with time because the violence feels isolated, distant, or impossible to imagine happening to ordinary people. The Heath case lingered because it felt frighteningly close to everyday life. The women he targeted were not drawn into criminal worlds or dangerous conspiracies. They met a man in familiar social settings, hotels, pubs, nightlife spaces, environments associated with relaxation, companionship, and post-war freedom. That ordinary context transformed the murders into something psychologically enduring. People could imagine themselves crossing paths with someone like Heath. They could imagine trusting him. And that realization unsettled Britain long after the headlines faded. In the years following the trial, discussions about Neville Heath often returned to the same haunting contradiction. How could someone appear so composed while carrying such extreme violence beneath the surface? Witnesses who encountered him before his arrest consistently described the same outward qualities. He was elegant, well-spoken, calm under pressure, confident in conversation. He appeared to understand exactly how to make others feel at ease. Those traits became inseparable from the crimes themselves because they were part of the mechanism that allowed the violence to happen. Heath did not rely on sudden force in public. He relied on trust first. He studied social expectations and used them as tools. That distinction remains one of the most disturbing elements of the case even decades later. There is a tendency in society to associate danger with visible instability. People often imagine violent offenders as socially awkward, openly aggressive, or immediately suspicious. Heath challenged those assumptions completely. He weaponized appearance, status, and charm. He proved that manipulation can sometimes be more dangerous than intimidation because it lowers defenses before violence begins. In post-war Britain, where military identity carried enormous respect, Heath understood exactly how to exploit cultural trust. A uniform opened doors for him socially and psychologically. It created immediate credibility. His stories of military achievement made him appear disciplined and heroic rather than predatory. Looking back now, the historical timing of the case feels deeply significant. Britain 1946 was emotionally vulnerable. The country had survived years of destruction, fear, and uncertainty. People wanted reassurance that peace meant safety. They wanted to rebuild relationships, careers, and ordinary routines. Social spaces filled again because society desperately needed relief from collective trauma. Heath entered that environment understanding how strongly people wanted to believe in confidence and sophistication. In many ways, he became a symbol of how predators exploit moments when societies are exhausted and eager to trust again. The lasting cultural memory of the case was shaped heavily by the press. Newspapers repeatedly emphasized Heath's outward refinement, often portraying him as the embodiment of hidden evil. The phrase, "the gentleman killer," survived precisely because it condensed the public's fear into a single image. A polite, educated man capable of horrifying cruelty. Yet there was also danger in that framing. Sensational coverage sometimes risked turning Heath himself into the center of fascination, while the victims slowly disappeared behind the mythology surrounding the killer. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout true crime history. Society becomes captivated by offenders who seem psychologically contradictory, while the people harmed by them become secondary characters in their own stories. But when stripped of the sensationalism and courtroom drama, the core tragedy remains painfully simple. Marjorie Gardner and Doreen Marshall encountered a manipulative predator at vulnerable moments in ordinary social environments. Their lives ended because Heath understood how to exploit trust more effectively than those around him recognized danger. That reality matters more than the mythology built afterward. Gardner was a woman navigating post-war London, working in entertainment during a period when the city itself was trying to recover emotionally and economically. Marshall was only 21 years old, entering adulthood in a Britain emerging from war. Both women should have had futures extending far beyond the brief moments that later defined newspaper headlines. Remembering them as human beings rather than merely victims is essential because the emotional weight of the case ultimately belongs not to Heath's performance, but to the lives destroyed by it. Criminal psychologists and investigators who later examined the Heath case often focused on observable personality characteristics repeatedly documented during the investigation and trial. Heath appeared emotionally detached. He manipulated easily. He displayed superficial charm and an apparent need for admiration. Most disturbingly, he seemed capable of maintaining composure even while confronting evidence of terrible violence. Yet perhaps the most revealing aspect of his behavior was not rage, but control. So much of Heath's life revolved around constructing identities, managing appearances, and shaping how others perceived him. The false military ranks, the medals, the polished speech, the elegant clothing, all of it formed part of an ongoing performance designed to dominate social situations. Even during the trial and final execution, reports suggested he remained concerned with presentation and outward composure. That consistency created the impression of someone deeply invested in image until the very end. Cases like Neville Heath's also changed the way investigators approached violent crime in Britain. Detectives became increasingly aware of the importance of behavioral patterns linking multiple offenses. The similarities between the Gardner and Marshall murders helped police recognize they were pursuing a repeat offender rather than isolated incidents. Investigators learned to pay closer attention to recurring methods of victim selection, manipulation tactics, and post-crime behavior. The case reinforced the understanding that some offenders operate through social engineering as much as physical violence. Heath's greatest weapon was often not force itself, but his ability to persuade victims and witnesses that he belonged wherever he went. The investigation additionally exposed weaknesses in post-war identification systems. Britain in the 1940s was still dealing with enormous bureaucratic disruption caused by years of war. Heath exploited that instability through aliases, false credentials, and fabricated stories. The ease with which he moved between cities and social circles revealed how vulnerable societies can become when trust mechanisms weaken during periods of large-scale upheaval. Yet beyond criminology and police procedure, the emotional legacy of the Heath case continues because it confronts audiences with uncomfortable truths about perception. Human beings instinctively judge others based on appearance, confidence, status, and social fluency. Heath understood those instincts and manipulated them expertly. He demonstrated how dangerous charisma can become when combined with deception and emotional detachment. That lesson remains relevant far beyond the historical details of one post-war murder case. The story also forces reflection on the nature of evil itself. Popular culture often portrays violent people as visibly monstrous, separated clearly from ordinary society. But the Heath case suggests something far more unsettling. Sometimes the most dangerous individuals are those who understand normality so well that they can imitate it convincingly. Heath knew how to mirror respectability. He understood manners, style, and social expectations. He could move comfortably through elegant environments because he studied how people behaved within them. That ability to imitate trustworthiness allowed him access to victims who never realized the danger, until it was too late. Perhaps that is why the case still feels haunting generations later. Not because it presents violence as incomprehensible, but because it reveals how recognizable and ordinary the surrounding circumstances appeared beforehand. A conversation in a pub, drinks shared between strangers, a confident officer checking into a hotel. None of those details sound inherently threatening. Yet within those ordinary moments existed the mechanism through which Heath operated. In the end, the Neville Heath case is remembered not simply as a story of murder, but as a warning about deception hidden beneath appearance. It reminds us how easily society can confuse polish with character, confidence with morality, or charm with safety. It reveals the danger of trusting performance over behavior. And perhaps most importantly, it leaves behind the memory of two women whose lives were stolen by a man who understood exactly how to make people lower their guard. Long after the newspapers stopped printing his name across front pages, that central truth remained the most disturbing part of all. Neville Heath did not look like a monster. He looked like someone society had been trained to trust.